Okay, so let's talk about the entire workflow of how a specific end user will view the reports in our app and how the whole flow of the process from front end to back end and cube will get executed, right? So, of course, to visualize any report, we need to make certain structures, right? So, see, what will happen is, let's say, assume that an admin will come and create all of the UI components, which we call workspace, folders, page, and views, right? These are all your navigations, right? This is how your reports are stored, and each page is consist of multiple views, right? And each view is nothing but one single screen, correct? So let's say when a user comes in, goes to my home menu and looks at their navigations and let's say clicks on page 2A. So this is where the user has clicked. What it means is the user is requesting to visualize or view all of the report which are part of page 2A. Okay. Now what is part of page 2A? So all of this information, right? Like which views are part of page 2A, which pivot report is part of which view, is everything stored in our data model, which is nothing but our models.py, right? That is where in the backend we will have all the information stored. So let's say if the user comes in and clicks on page 2A, it means the user is asking us, to open a new window and let's say give the user data of view 1, okay, which is part of the page 2A. Now view 1 is split into 2 by 2 matrix, right? 2 by 2 grid. You can see two rows, two columns, so these are like 2 by 2 grids. And let's say each grid has one report attached to it. Okay, I when I say report, I mean a pivot report. Okay. So when the user comes in and clicks on page 2A, essentially the user is saying that I want to see view 1, which consists of four different reports, and each report can have multiple dimensions, multiple fact table and measures that the user might want to see it in particular format, right? So that is for like one report. Another report might have different dimensions, different fact table, and so on. So let's say view 1 has these four grids that needs to be rendered, and each of the grid has a pivot table. So if I go to the widget manager, assume that we have these four reports that need to be rendered on that same view in like 2 by 2 format, right? So these are the four reports. So each report will have its own definition, right? Each report, so let's say sales report 2, the meaning of sales report 2 is it must include this fact table, this fact table, this fact table. It should include this measure, this measure, this measure, and it should also include these attributes. So let's say that is the definition of a sales report. Similarly, forecast report 4 might require another fact tables and so on and so forth, right? So this is what the user is eventually requesting to view. So if we take this example, basically the user is asking to render four different reports which is part of view 1. So from the point of view of front end, when the user comes in and clicks on this page to a navigation, it is supposed to generate some dynamic URL endpoints which will hit certain APIs of the backend. Okay, so like you can assume that dynamic URL endpoints are made of something like this. So workspace, folder, page, and view, everything is captured dynamically. So when the user clicks on page 2a, it should generate some endpoints like this, just as an example. Okay. So this endpoint will in turn hit some backend API. Once it hits the backend API, the job of the backend would start first, right? First, backend needs to understand what is the request coming from the user. So it's coming for viewing this particular page and this particular view. Now backend can try and understand, okay, this particular view, how many reports this view has. So as we said, this, let's assume that this view has 4 reports, and these are the 4 reports that the view has. So backend will know that each of the report has which dimensions, which attributes, which measures that need to be displayed. So what the backend will do first, it will try to create this request of, so basically backend needs to generate 4 different requests for queue, one for each of the report, right? So let's say this is one report, this is one report, this is one report, this is one report. For each of the widget or a report or a grid, backend will generate one request each, which will go to the cube, and cube will fetch the data and give it back to the backend. Correct? So 4 reports mean 4 different requests. Now backend needs to raise those 4 different requests in a specific format which Cube will understand. So we are, you can call it more like a Cube request builder. So backend will have this kind of a capability, which is to build request for cubes. These are like API request builder for Cube, right? Because Cube will want the request in a certain format. So when backend tries to hit the APIs of Cube, it needs to go in certain format. So as the backend knows that which reports needs to be viewed and which report contains which fact table, what is the name of the measure that needs to be seen, etc., etc. Based on all of that information which is already there in the models.py file, backend will generate a request for cube which is more in the format that the cube will understand, right? So you can see like it might create something similar to this, right? So the measures, it will list down all the measures that needs to go into that report, all the dimensions, all the time dimensions, all the filters that the user is requesting, etc. So this is the purpose of that cube request builder which backend will generate, and then this request will hit cube API. Then cube will do its internal work, right? So it has query planner, SQL, it will generate SQL query on itself. It will hit that query to the database and fetch the results for us and give those results back to the backend server first. And backend will pass on that results as a response to the front end request, right? So ultimately backend will give back the data from cube to the front end eventually, right? And the front end will have to render all of this in these formats that we talked about, right? So front end also needs to understand that when a certain request comes in for a particular page and a particular view, how that view is made up of, right? Is it a 2 by 2 grid? It needs to understand the, okay, these are the 2 by 2 grids the front end needs to render everything into, and then backend will give the response against those grids, and you will receive the output from the backend against these grids, and that needs to be rendered in the pivot format. So front end will need to figure out what best libraries, frameworks we can use to render all of this here. Okay, so you can take an example, right? So let's say if I go to, it might take some time. Okay, sorry. We were trying to look for an example. So let's say the user is navigating to this workspace. Okay, supply master planning. This is the name of the workspace, and then the user is also requesting to navigate to one of the folders and pages of that workspace. Okay, we will go to other tenant. Okay, now we can see. So you can see here, right? The user has requested to navigate to this particular workspace and this particular page, and this is the view that the user wants to navigate to. Right? What it has done is it has created this custom dynamic endpoint URL, and you can see here. So this is the name of the workspace, this name of the folder, and name of the view. So everything gets created here dynamically. Okay, and then these are some of the filters that the user has applied. If I increase the filters, I might see more data. So now the data has been fetched by the backend and it's being presented here. Okay. So front end will need to figure out all of these libraries where we can do these kind of filterings, we can do multiple selections. And when the front end sends this request to the backend, it needs to give this filtering config in its request, right? So which is the user who is sending this request and what are the filters users has selected, because there are two types of filters. One is like these are like global filters, and then there are in pivot filters, right, which are within the pivot itself, like this, right? And there are lots of other capabilities, so you can change the position of the columns from here to there. Okay, you can hide the columns as well, so you can hide certain columns, you can unhide certain columns. So here also you can hide lot of columns. Then you can change the position of the column from either rows to the column. So now week is displayed here on the column. So if I change it to rows, weeks will be displayed on the rows, like this, right? So all of these capabilities is what we need to build on the front end rendering side. Okay, so when the data comes back, front end will need to render it in the pivot format by understanding which data needs to be shown in columns, which data needs to be shown in rows, and how it needs to be displayed, right? So this is like the overall workflow of the entire navigation, right? So front user comes in, asks to view certain pages and views. Based on that, front end will create a request, to the backend. Backend will generate uh, the request which needs to be sent to the queue, but backend will do it based on its understanding of the model, right? So backend will need to understand based on our model.py file and the data in those models, which contain all the information about the reports, right? So which report has which measure and all. So backend will generate a request for cube and hit the cube API. Okay. Now in terms of how cube works, so when you try to query multiple fact tables into single table together, so cube tries to join those using full outer join. Now this document talks about it does it based on left join, which is not entirely correct. Okay, so left join is typically when a fact table and dimension table is being joined. Here you can see, right, this is orders table and this is customer name. So joining customer with orders is what typically is done by left join to preserve the data. Okay, so because we want to preserve the orders data, so let's say if Charlie has no orders, you want to preserve the customer name Charlie, right? That's the reason why this is done here. But when we talk about multiple fact tables being joined, it is done by cube in a particular format. So if I go here, multiple fact queries, and I will take an example, right? So let's take the same example which is there in this documentation of the cube.